Good afternoon to you all, members of the profession of interpreting and translation, particularly those of you who are working in the legal sectors. My name is Silvana Pavlovska. This is going to be on the three-cornered situation paradigm, the professional duties of interpreters, the recipients, and the ethics of the profession of interpreting. This will be part 2, and in the first part, which is in a separate video, which I urge you to watch before you watch this one, we talked about the interpreted interview or the three-cornered situation and what the communication dynamics involved were. In this part 2, we are going to deal with the concepts of client or recipient of the service of interpreting. So who are the client and the recipient? Unfortunately, this rather obvious conclusion from the dynamics of the three-cornered situation escapes a lot of interpreting practitioners and other professionals with whom they work. When we talk about professionals, in this context, we talk about the English-speaking persons, usually the ones who conduct interviews, particularly in the legal court settings. Most interpreters will often refer to the words the client in the singular. And this always means the non-English speaking party. Now, this sort of language does a lot of damage to the image of the profession of interpreting, and it creates distorted perceptions of what interpreting is, because it implies that the English-speaking professional is not the interpreter's client. And yet, as a model, the model abundantly and obviously shows there are often two parties who receive the interpretation. At least two parties, there could be more. We can thus call these two parties the recipients of the interpreting services. So to reinterpret the schema, which we covered last time in part 1, the English-speaking professional continues to have the non-English-speaking speaker as their client, while both the English-speaking professional and the non-English-speaking client background person, the client of the English-speaking professional, are the recipients of the interpreting services. I hope I haven't confused you. So we've got the English-speaking person conducting the interview usually. They've got their client who's non-English speaking person, and then you've got the professional interpreter. Both of these persons are recipients of the interpreting service. In fact, interpreting as a practical and physical activity is not possible unless there are two parties, at least, who have a pre-existing relationship and they need to communicate with each other. Try interpreting with only one recipient present. Have you tried doing that? Therefore, the English-speaking professional who depends on the interpreter to communicate with their non-English speaking background client is as much the recipient of the interpreting services as is the non-English speaking background client. This situation of referring to the non-English speaking background recipient as the client in the singular has arisen because we have allowed certain professional and client models and relationships that apply to monolingual professions to dictate how interpreting is viewed as a profession. It has also arisen because of the attitude or attitudes outlined previously about the disadvantage of not speaking English in Australia and notions of non-English speaking background people that they need help. We have allowed a situation to develop where the interpreter is seen as just a member of the linguistic and cultural community of the non-English speaking background client, since the interpreter is the one who speaks their language and in the vast majority of cases comes from the ethnic group of that non-English speaking background client. Indeed, it is not unusual to see the interpreter as part of the problem. This has been talked about in the interpreters and the legal system uh, on page 14 of our book. By the way, we are using our book, a training handbook for legal and court interpreters in Australia, written by Mary Vasilakakos on behalf of language experts. It's our language experts copyright publication, and it's available for purchase on our website or contacting us via email or telephone. We are encouraged to see interpreted interviews as situations that, by definition, involve two types of professional expertise. One is the transfer skills of the interpreter, and two, the domain-specific skills of the other person, the English-speaking person, usually performing some professional task, like, in the legal area, the health area, education, immigration, and so on. When we approach the matter in this way, the ethics of the professional interpreter become obvious too. We transfer the meaning of both parties to both recipients on an equal basis. Okay? On an equal basis. No biases, no partiality, no subjectivity. We do not replace what these parties would normally do. We do not speak on anyone's behalf or take over the responsibility for the communication from anyone. Professional interpreters can state their discrete area of professional expertise, their transfer skills, with confidence, because these skills stem logically from a systematic and rational approach to the three-cornered situation paradigm. There is an overwhelming and very simple approach to solving any ethical problem that we may encounter during our practice. We ask ourselves, if the two parties or recipients of the interpreting service, that is, the English-speaking so-called professional and their client, were able to conduct the interview in the same language, who would do what? This continues to apply when an interpreter is present. The two recipients of the interpreting services continue to be responsible for generating the utterances and the meaning. The interpreter is responsible for transferring that meaning. It may be worthwhile for us to examine the current version of the Aussie Code of Ethics at this stage to see what extent it embodies and exemplifies the professional principles stemming out of the three-cornered situation model discussed in this chapter or in this part 2 of our broadcast. Who are the clients and the recipients in legal settings? So now it's specific to legal settings. Legal settings vary in great deal and range from civil law tribunals to criminal justice at state and federal levels. Sometimes the interpreter has whole groups of people to deal with, and we can argue that the entire legal system really and its clients are the clients of the interpreter, but that the specific parties receiving the interpreting services on any single occasion are the recipients of those services. In fact, the three-cornered situation doesn't imply that the two parties receiving the interpretation, that is the recipients, are individuals only. Sometimes there will be individuals, sometimes there will be complex groups, sometimes the situation will be asymmetrical with one individual on one side and a group of people on the other. However, No matter how complex the group dynamics, during the interpretation process, the interpreter always has two linguistic sides who are the recipients of the interpreting services, the two language directions, that is source language and target language, in which the interpretation is being carried out. So all other pre-existing professional to client relationships do remain. And on top of this is superimposed the interpreter's own relationship to the two recipients receiving that interpretation. The emerging dynamics are thus very complex, with the two levels of professional expertise being provided at the same time. The legal practitioners are delivering law, and at the same time, the interpreting practitioner delivers transfer of meaning services. We make reference in this chapter or this part 2 of this broadcast that we've made reference in chapter 1 of our publication, how complex understanding meaning in context is. And the interpreter has to do this in two languages in the professional domain of the particular situation being interpreted. In our case, a whole variety of legal settings. And by the way, we will talk about how complex understanding meaning is in context in other parts. The task is complex indeed, requiring a whole range of mental, linguistic, cultural, contextual, physical skills, and so on. The interpreter simply doesn't have the time to do anything other than to interpret. Any attempt to do more than that can have fairly disastrous consequences for all involved. We may also at this point add the following to our working definition of what the duty of the interpreter is. The interpreter should provide the best transfer of meaning they possibly can to both recipients of the interpreting services, doing so by using all their different types of expertise in a concerted way. The interpreter should do this as quickly as possible or practicable, efficiently and unobtrusively, inferring as little as possible in the proceedings, interfering as little as possible in the proceedings in which the interpreting takes place. We would like to add that the best interpreter is the one who is the least noticed by their clients or recipients of service. And that was part 2 of our new series, which we've dedicated to interpreters outside our usual marketing videos we provide you with each week or each fortnight on a regular basis about what sort of training is available for interpreters and translators. So today in part 2, we've talked about the clients or recipients. Who are they? And I am hoping that we've given you some insights and you have some understanding, particularly those, that we refer to as recipients of service in the legal settings. Next time in part 3, we are going to look at other important information related to the duties, the ethics of interpreting, to create more awareness about the duties of the interpreter, about the ethical obligations and responsibilities that they adhere to. And not just in Australia, this also applies to any interpreter working in any other part of the world. So we'll talk about important issues as they relate to the interpreting profession in Australia specifically, and I invite you to join me for part 3, which will be broadcast very, very soon. So thank you for your attention. This has been Silvana Pavlovska, your practitioner of interpreting translation educator. a former lecturer at RMIT University in both the diploma and the advanced diploma courses, as well as uh, a journalist, seasoned journalist with one's own YouTube channel, where we interview people on topics that are of interest to the public and ourselves. So thanks again, and I'm looking forward to seeing you very soon.